Today we're going over my long-term review of the Sigma FP and if I still would recommend it to filmmakers in 2021. But first, if you're new to the channel, my name is Anson, and on this channel we talk about filmmaking, specifically budget gear, tutorials, and a behind-the-scenes look at the projects that I'm working on. So if that's something you're into, consider subscribing. Now last year I did do my initial review on the Sigma FP, but it has been some time. I have since then made it my A camera, fired it from my A camera, and now use it as my kind of walk around camera. And so I want to give you my thoughts on this camera after going through all the trials and tribulations with it. So with that being said, I'm going to give you guys some pros and cons. And because I don't want this to be a super long video, we're going to go right into it and start first with the pros. And the first pro for me is, of course, the RAW capabilities of this camera. Now I said this in my initial review that this camera does shoot RAW, and I think that's what still makes this camera stand out in the market that it's in, is the fact that it's a sub $2,000 camera, a full frame camera, and it does shoot in RAW cinema DNG. Now one can say you don't necessarily need RAW, and that's completely true. If you nail everything in camera, you really don't need RAW capabilities. You don't need 12-bit RAW cinema DNG. But I will say over the last 8 to 10 months, I have recovered a lot of footage, and so I massively appreciate the fact that this thing does shoot in cinema DNG RAW. Now something to keep in mind is you do have the ability to shoot 12-bit cinema DNG RAW to an SD card internally on the camera. As long as you shoot at 24 frames per second and in full HD, you're going to be able to record to the SD card. So you don't necessarily need an SSD for that. If you can hear piano playing in the background, it's because my daughter decided she wanted to play piano randomly while I'm filming this episode. So that may be my new background music, is a piano playing. The other thing I believe that I mentioned in my initial review that I want to touch on again is the Sigma FP's low light capability. This is something that over the time of having this camera has impressed me more and more. I really believe that this camera is on par with maybe like an A7 III from Sony. Maybe not the A7S III because that thing can basically see in the dark, but the ISOs that you can push this camera to and not see a ton of grain is impressive. And so if I'm doing the low light shoots or low light productions, I'm probably going to gravitate more to this camera than I am even the Pocket 6K or 4K, just because the overall low light capabilities of this camera is just butter. I don't know what butter means, but it's what YouTube says, and so what the hell ever. The other thing I've grown to appreciate is how compact this is. Even when I rig out this camera, it is substantially lighter than my Pocket 4K or 6K when it's rigged out. And so I really love shooting with this camera just because I don't feel like it's a ton of weight. It's not big and bulky. It's just so compact and easy to use. All right, I've got my daughter playing piano. I've got the lawnmower guy outside, so we're on borrowed time. Let's keep going. There are two small things I appreciate about this camera as well. One is the fact that it does shoot in shutter angle. Now that's a small detail, but it actually helps a lot. When you go over into higher frame rates, you don't also have to flip over your shutter speed and change that as well. You can just set it to 180-degree shutter angle and then go between your frame rates without having to change what the shutter angle is. It actually makes your workflow way more efficient when you have the ability to shoot in shutter angle rather than shutter speed. The other thing that I've come to appreciate is the color profiles that come with the Sigma FP. I've actually been shooting a lot of black and white lately, and if I shoot on the Pocket 4K or 6K, I have to do all that in post, but with the Sigma FP, I can just put it on the mono profile, and I've been doing a lot of that lately and have really loved the results. Now, I don't use these all the time, especially on professional shoots, but if I'm just doing walk around shots or stuff with my family, which is what I use the Sigma FP a lot for lately, then the color profiles is something that's really nice to have because you just don't really have to worry about color grading in post, especially if you're doing something like in black and white. So those are some of the things that I love about this camera. Let's talk about some things I don't love or potentially hate from this camera. One of the things I can't stand about this camera is the overall IO options. I mentioned this in my initial review of maybe why I wouldn't use this on productions, and genuinely that's the reason it got demoted from my A camera to really my walk around camera, is the fact that it doesn't offer a ton of IO options. I don't like micro HDMI, and I also don't like the fact that while you do have USB-C, you're gonna have to rely on that USB-C a ton if you wanna shoot in higher frame rates or potentially in 4K if you're trying to use Cinema DNG RAW. And that comes to my next point that I hate, and that's the overall media options. You have the ability to either shoot on an SD card or an SSD. I have gotten to where I do not like carrying around SSDs. I don't like having them on my rig. And so if that's the case, I'm gonna have to shoot to an SD card. and that really limits me on what I can do with this camera. And so I really wish it came with other media options, maybe a CFast option or a CF Express even, but it doesn't, and so you're limited to either SD or SSD. And so that's a big negative for me, and one of the reasons why I wouldn't list it as a cinema camera is because it doesn't really offer a ton of media options when it comes to shooting. One thing that also drives me nuts, and you saw it with the FPL, is the fact that you can't charge while filming. I don't understand why that was left out of this camera, and you can see that they put it in the FPL, and I was really hoping for the fact that with the firmware 3.0 that they were going to put it in this camera, but it did not make the cut. I don't know if that's like a hardware limitation or what have you, but the fact that you still can't charge while recording is something that drives me nuts. So with that, let's talk about my overall thoughts and if I would still recommend this camera to filmmakers in 2021. This camera is not for everyone, and it does have some limitations. But with that being said, anyone that owns this camera generally falls in love with this camera. I very much put this in a line as far as cult following with the original pocket camera. I feel like it has that same type of following where yes, it has its limitations, but when you film stuff with it, it just looks amazing. And so people look past those limitations because of what you can get out of it. Now with that, as far as the question of if I would recommend this to filmmakers in 2021, I truly believe that no other camera in this price point offers what this camera offers. You have a full frame camera that shoots cinema DNG RAW, that's really stellar in low light and has amazing color science. For what it offers, it is an amazing camera, and if it meets the criteria of what you're trying to use on your next project, you should absolutely check it out. So that's it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of this long-term review of the Sigma FP. Let me know in the comments below if you do have questions about this camera. And as always, thank you for joining. Go and find your journey. Go embrace life. Stay safe, be happy, support each other. Wash those hands, and I'll see you here next time. Peace. All right, so I'm cleaning up. I'm gonna give you guys the tip of the day. When you're using a slate, always clean it off after your shoot. What happens is if you don't, you will permanently have on your slate, and it's hard to come off. So be a good first AC and clean your slates. The more you know.